Hello everybody, welcome back to Code Shots with Profanis. In this video we're going to see what the HTTP resource is and how to use it. Before we jump to the code, we will first discuss why not using an effect. Then we will see the theory part, and last but definitely not least, we will see a practical example. Without any further delay, let's get started. So I would like first to start by answering three different questions. Let's start with the first one. How about if you have your application and you would like to display a loading indicator? And please think that we do not have HTTP resource, we do not have signals, we just want to have a loading indicator. How can we achieve that? Well, one easy way to do that is that via an HTTP call function, your HTTP call function, we can have this loading boolean type and make that to true while invoking that HTTP call, and then into the finalize, converting that to false. Sooner or later, you realize that this is not a dry solution, right? And you would like to have that more reusable, and you decide to create a custom observable. So into a custom observable, what you could do is into the next phase, you can just mark that as is loading, and then into the error phase is not loading, and again into the complete to mark that again is not loading. So this is something that you can reuse, and then what you could do is just use that into a pipe, since this is a custom RxJS operator, and this is it. And by providing the loading state, what you could do is something like loading state.isLoading, and of course then you can use that into an if condition. And please note that currently what we are discussing is a solution using a custom RxJS operator, and of course the code is more or less pseudocode, no more than that. This is just an idea. So let's now see the second question, which is similar to the loading indicator, but this time what you have to achieve is to display an error message whenever we have an error response. So how can we deal with that? Well, in the same way, into the make HTTP call, your HTTP call, what you can do is to have something like hasError equals to false, and then into a catchError operator, you can have this hasError equals to true to make that you know what, I have an error. Or this hasError equals to error. You have to decide how to deal with this one. Since this is not that dry, you would prefer to utilize the previous custom RxJS operator, and what we can do is, again, into the next phase, we can have the no error, and then into the error phase, you can just mark that as hasError, and into the complete phase, clear the state so that we do not have any leftover error. Nice. So how can we use that? In the same way. So here you can use your custom RxJS operator, you can provide your loading state, something that we will mutate later on via the RxJS operator, and use that here. So loading state.hasError. Something like that. And this is just, like I said previously, just an idea. And of course, if you forgot to use the custom operator, you will have compilation errors. And now let's go to the third question, and this has to do with dynamic HTTP calls or reactive HTTP calls. And what I would like to highlight with this one is the following. Let's assume that we have a type ahead component, and into the search recipes here, what we can have is just a signal string or an ng model, a form control, something to have just a binding. And whenever we're typing, what we would like to do is to make an HTTP call. So if we type PIZ, then we will have three different calls. And wouldn't it be nice here to cancel the unfinished HTTP calls? Yeah, it would be nice to cancel them. And one could say here, you know what, if we're going to use a signal, can we use an effect instead? Well, using an effect could be an option. However, this is not designed for asynchronous state. In general, signals are designed to handle synchronous state and not asynchronous one. And using an effect, it can also lead to undesired state. Let's see an example. Let's assume that we would like to make two HTTP calls, one at time 0 and the other one at time 1. At time 0, we would like to request for triangles. We are making the request, and we know that the response will last for 500 milliseconds, and after this time we will get our nice triangles. Awesome. In between, we are sending another request, and this time we are requesting for circles. And since the HTTP is unpredictable sometimes, that response will last for 100 milliseconds, and this time we will have the circles back. Nice. So the user will eventually get the circles, but after a period of time, the user will get back the triangle, which is not desired. So this is the wrong thing to do. So what we said previously is that the signals are designed to handle synchronous state, and on the other side we have an asynchronous state, right? So we need somehow to bridge them together. So how can we do that? A quote about the asynchronous is that at some point we will have the data. How about now if we try to convert that and make it that we will always have data? And to make that happen, what we can do is the following. Having the HTTP, we can have an isLoading Boolean flag, we can have the error, and at the same time we can have the data. Having these three things at the same time, we can make that synchronous, which means that isLoading will be true or false. We will always have value there. The error will have null undefined or the actual error, and the data will have the actual response from the HTTP. How about now if we can have them as signal values? isLoading as a signal, error as a signal, and data as a signal as well. And by having them as signal, they can contribute to the signal graph, which means that as soon as I have the value here, a different value, if the signal is marked as dirty, then I can do something into my UI since this will trigger a change detection. And all of these things, we can achieve them with HTTP resource. So let's now jump and see the theory part about the HTTP resource. So the HTTP resource makes a reactive HTTP request and exposes the status, the thing that we discussed previously, isLoading or the error, and at the same time we'll have the response value, the data that we discussed previously. And the HTTP resource accepts two different arguments. The first argument could be a string, object, or function, and the second argument could be options. So let's see now how to use the HTTP resource using a string. Into the parentheses, we can use here our endpoint, and this could be api.com, and then we can have our signal value. And please note that the signal value is the actual dependency. And this will work in a similar way with the effect, which means that as soon as the signal value marked as dirty will have a different value, then an actual HTTP call will be invoked. And now let's see how to use the HTTP resource not with string, but this time with an object. And what we can have here into the object, we can provide the URL, we can provide the method, and we can provide the param. And similar way with the string, the signal value here is a dependency, but not only that, the query param signal value is a dependency as well. Which means that here we have the query parameters and here we have the path parameters. And whenever we have any of the dependencies marked as dirty, then we will have an HTTP call happening. And this is very interesting, the method. And here we can provide get, and we can even provide a post. But please note, the HTTP resource is not designed for mutations. The HTTP resource is designed to fetch data. So you might be wondering here, and why do we have the method there? Why not having get all the time, since this is what we have from the REST principle? Well, the idea with this one is that the Angular team tried to make that as much flexible as it can be. And why is that? There are some API calls that they require the method post to fetch some data. And that's why we have this kind of option. And now let's see how to use the HTTP resource, but this time using a function. And same thing. Please note that here we'll have the arrow function, and we'll have the HTTPS, api.com, your API, whatever we would like to invoke, and then we'll have the signal value. So what is the difference with the string? The difference here is that we can return an undefined. And if we return an undefined, we won't invoke any HTTP call. Now let's see how to use the options. And into that example, I'm using just the string here, just for simplicity. And for the options, we can provide the default value, and the default value will take place whenever we have a failure from the HTTP call. And we can even have a parse And for this one, we can even use Zod to make sure that our response is the correct one. And now you might be wondering, how can we use that? Well, here I have the HTTP resource and I assign that to a resource. And now let's see how to use that into the HTML side. What we can do is if resource.isLoading, and please note that this is just a signal value, then we can display a loading indicator. If the resource has an error, then we'll display just an error indicator. And eventually, if we have the actual value, we can do something with the value. And what is great with this one is that since both is loading, the error and the data are signals, we can even compute a different state by deriving a new state by the actual value. So let's answer now the question that we saw previously. We discussed about the loading indicator. Are we done with this one? Yes. We saw that we have the isLoading, which is true or false. How about the error? Again, using the HTTP resource, we have the error signal, which has the actual error object. And how about the data? And again, we saw the data, but I feel here that we have some questions. How can I cancel the previous HTTP calls? Well, the HTTP resource behaves similar to switch map, which means that it cancels the previous HTTP calls. And how can I debounce the calls? And the answer here is that we shouldn't debounce the call, we should debounce the value. And for this one, we can use RxJS. And we'll see also an example later. So let's now jump into the coding part to see a practical example. For this example, we will try to create a type ahead. And here we have the search recipes input field. And whenever we start typing, we would like to have here the actual recipes from an API call. So let's now go to VS Code and see what we have. So this is what my HTML looks like, which is nothing like a material form field with a label, and then I have an input where I have my mat autocomplete with this auto, which is this guy here. And the only thing that I have just some hard-coded values, option 1 and option 2. And please note that here I decide to have just a search input, which is a form control. So the idea now is whenever we start typing, we would like to make some HTTP calls. So let's start using the HTTP resource. So here I will have my, let's say I will name that options resource equals an HTTP resource. And here I can provide directly the API call. So this is the one that I have, and here into the query parameter, I can provide the actual value. And this could be my search input. But please note that we'll have to convert that into a signal. So let's use that. I will name that search input to use. And let's do now the following. I will have here my this.search input, and I will have my value changes, and I will wrap that into the toSignal. Something like that. And then into the search input to use, since this is now a signal, I will use that here. Let me just switch that to backticks. And now I can have this guy here. Nice. So whenever we type anything into the input field, we expect to have an HTTP call. But you know what? I will convert that into a function just to have a condition. If I have an actual value, only then I would like to make an HTTP call, otherwise I will return an undefined. Nice. So having the options resource, as you can see, this returns unknown, and I know that this guy will return a list of recipes, and I have already created here my type. So I will have here the recipe response. Nice. So let's now use this one, the options resource, into the HTML, and at the very first thing, we would like just to have an iteration and have different options. So here I would just have a for option of options resource, and I know that this has a value, and I will also have here a track, and I would like to track the option. Nice. And what is the problem here? Type recipes response must have a symbol iterator method that returns an iterator. Yeah, Of course, here I have to use just my recipes because this is what I have as an array. So now here I will just delete the second one and I will use here my option one. And I would like to display the recipe name. Nice. So having this one, let's go to the browser to see what we have. I would like to start searching for pizzas. And as you can see, like what we said previously, the HTTP resource behaves similar to switch map. It cancels the previous unfinished HTTP calls. But what we don't like with this one is that we are invoking that many HTTP calls. So let's go again back to VS Code to see how to debounce that value. So having here the search input as a form control, and since I have the value changes and the value change is actually unobservable, this is easier to achieve that. And actually, I will simply have here my pipe and a debounce type of, let's say, 300 milliseconds. And now if I go to the browser and start typing, you can see that I have only one request. So wouldn't it be nice now to display also a loading indicator? Let's go to VS Code and give it a try. And I would like to display the loading indicator just below my input, and for this one I will use a mat progress bar. But I don't want to have that all the time. I would like to display the progress bar whenever this loading is true. So let's have this like that. If my options resource dot is loading, if this is true, then I would like to display this one. So again, let's go to the browser to see what we have. And if I start typing, as you can see, for a while we had this nice progress bar. But how about whenever we do not have some data? Wouldn't it be nice also to have a visual indication that something happened? So let's do this as well. And for this one, I would prefer to have another mat option, and the value could be something like no recipes found. But I don't want to have this option all the time there. I would like to have that when I do not have data and when this loading is false. And this is my condition. So let's go to the browser. And now if I start typing for pizza, something that I know that we will have eventually a response, we will have that back. But if I start typing gibberish, we'll have the no recipes found. And if we clear that, this one goes away. Nice. So up to that point, it seems that we have a type ahead using an HTTP resource. How about now if we have an error? So let's give that a try. And to achieve that, I will simply type here anything. And now if we go to the browser and we start typing, we have an error, but we do not have a visual indication. And just for the sake of this video, I will have here a mat error and have just a condition being like if my options resource dot error, if this is truthy, then I would like to display the error inside my mat error. Something like that, and I also use a JSON pipe. So now if I start typing, we can see that we have the actual error. Awesome. So far we have seen how to use the HTTP resource by providing the URL, which is the first argument. Let's now see the second argument, where we can have the default value and also we can have a parse method. So let's give that a try. So for the second argument, we can provide the default value, and I also have here my mock recipes, something that I have already prepared, which is no more like a mock pizza and some ingredients, and we will use that instead. And if I start typing, we can see that we have also the mock pizza whenever we are idle. So let's now see how to use the parse. So I will delete the default value from here, and instead I will use a parse here, where I know that this is just a function and I can do something with the response. And for the response, I have already prepared a response schema so that we can validate if the actual schema is correct. So let's go there to see what we have. It's the response schema using Zod, and I know that the very first level is an object, and the object contains a recipes array, a total number, skip number, and limit number. If we now go to the browser, we expect everything to work as expected. Awesome. How about though if we change now the total, and instead of having number here, I will have just a string. Well, as you can see, we have an error, so let's scroll down, and it seems that we have an error here, but what is happening? Well, whenever we're using a parse, the type can be inferred via the parse function. However, we have now a conflict from the infer type and this type, which is my recipe's response. So let me delete that. And now we know that the options resource, the type will be inferred from that parse function. And if we go to the browser, and now we expect to have here just an error. And the error says that invalid type, expected string, received number, which is the error from Zod. So this is a neat way of how to applying a schema validation. But other than that, the thing that we said previously is that the type of my options resource is inferred by the parse, which means that perhaps I can do more things here. Here we can have just my parsed response. And how about now if I want to return only my recipes? So if I do that, now the options resource knows that I have only my recipes here, and let's do a change to these errors. And now we expect everything to work as expected. Oh yeah, let's go back and fix the wrong type that we applied, and that goes into my total, and this should be a number. And now if we go to the browser, we can see that everything works as expected. Nice. And since we can parse that, perhaps we can even apply here just a map, and that map could do anything for us. For example, I would like to have my recipe, and the name, I would like to have that as lowercase. And now, if we go to the browser, we expect everything to be lowered case. Awesome. But here I'm using Zod just for the parsing. How about if you don't like for any reason to use Zod, but you want to apply a logic? So what we can do is the following. The response here is type unknown, so we could do just like response, I will name that to use, equals as unknown, as, and then we can just cast that as recipe's response because I know that this is my type. And then using the response to use recipes to apply just a map function, and I will do the same thing. I will just going to have my recipe name to lowercase, and then I will return my response to use. Now, if I go to the HTML, we can see that we have an error. Why? Well, let's examine that for a while together. Here we're returning the recipe's response, which is the higher level, and if we go to that type, the recipe's response returns also that kind of property. So let me scroll down a bit. And if you remember previously, we had into our HTML code iterating over the recipes, but now we are not doing that. So let's undo that change. So now if I go to my browser, I expect everything to work as expected, and now I have my pizzas to lowercase. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. We discussed about the HTTP resource, which is an amazing new functionality, and currently this is marked as a developer preview. And if you like my video, please don't forget to subscribe and click the ring bell. See you in the next video.